what do we think the response from China is, is going to be? I mean,
yeah, there is an interesting aspect that comes into play, and I think it's a very clever and smooth diplomatic move almost on the China side. Is you have the US banning a Chinese company, and obviously it's a little bit of a proxy, right? It's not just Huawei; it's actually going against China. Huawei is not really a privately owned company, so you could imagine also China, the government, going after a specific US company, going after Intel, Microsoft, Google, and so on. But they don't. And this is, I think, the clever part is to issue a new piece of regulation back in June that Nate mentioned, that is essentially targeting the supply chain of security products for specific industry here in China. So for example, you are an energy provider here in China and you're using specific software to monitor the security of your network. You need to be able to demonstrate that the ecosystem where your product lives is not threatened by any diplomatic or trade tension, and this is in actually the regulation. So, for example, let's say you are a European company, you're buying a Belgium product to monitor the security of your system here in China, except the part of the product transits, for example, through a cloud provider in the US, then you potentially you're banned from using that product simply because it goes through a tensed region. So the way it's actually worded, it's nothing against the US, and it can be used against many different regions, and it's very flexible. And the rationale behind this is always to protect national safety and the sovereignty of the Chinese internet. So it's again, it's a very not
more
clear.
nuanced.
Exactly, it's a very nuanced approach. It's not a straight answer with the same type of dialogue or in the same battlefield. Essentially, it's completely different. And I think that the Chinese response is going to continue in that tradition to reply, but on other terrain, simply because they can control that terrain, and it can never be deemed specifically against the US.
Yeah, and just to sort of piggyback on that as well. This whole situation, especially with the June regulation, sort of speaks to something that that is important about the development of this in China as well. I mean, years and years ago, of course, China, when they were developing IT infrastructure and things like that, there was a lot of concern on the China side about whether or not, let's say a Windows operating system or an Intel chip or whatever would have US backdoors, could be controlled by the US, and that they would wake up one morning and every computer with an Intel chip was off, right? There was that concern, but there really wasn't any choice to use US technology years in the past decade or two. I think that's changing. There's also domestic capability is being built up, and so we're seeing more of those concerns being codified in such a way that they can actually they can do something about it, right? Flexibly, of course, like Nico said. But I think the overall discussion here indicates that China is feeling, I'd say, much more confident about its capabilities here.
There was a response actually that was targeting US equipment used in Chinese administration, which was not an official statement. It was just an internal notice that was leaked a few months ago, and but it's something that is simply not practical. There is no 100% Chinese computer yet made. There is no 100% Chinese software that is, or software suite that is able to replace, for example, Microsoft product or Intel product. So even that informal notice was actually not considered as a true response to the US ban. So I'm really thinking that the response from China is going to be on very soft and very nuanced regulation that can apply to US or not.
That it's not the tradition of Chinese government policy making and rulemaking to do that. There is a tendency to keep things vague and be able to have some flexibility in how the rules are applied, and also not, as we've talked about before, not looking to single out any particular company. Having said that, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the impact to U.S. companies here, because this is not happening in a vacuum. And there's a lot of U.S. companies with a lot of business here at stake in China. We're already maybe a bit nervous before this, but this only kind of ratcheted things up a bit. At the same time, I think, I don't think China is looking to necessarily come down hard on U.S. technology companies, because that just creates a tit for tat back and forth. And I think China can't win that game in the short term. And so I think that there's probably some apprehension there of trying to escalate things up and come down too hard on any U.S. technology companies here. But I think on the business side, there's just inevitably going to be more and more of an impact. I have my thoughts on that out to the panel on how we see the impact to U.S. companies here in their business.
Well, just really quickly, Nalin brought up Qualcomm. I mean, a huge portion of Qualcomm's business is done in China. So that's just, I mean, that's just one of the many companies that this is going to impact, and I'm sure they're going to be having their feedback heard in Washington as well.
Yeah, I would say a similar thing for example, ARM, right? I mean, it's UK based, but still, I think there's going to be a movement in China towards a different processor architecture, like the RISC architecture, which is supposedly open source, right? But definitely, I can tell you, Huawei is probably right now investigating that very hard, right? Or HiSilicon is looking at that pretty hard and trying to figure out how they would replace an ARM processor with a RISC processor, for example, right? So that's happening. So, and I can see that, and if you look at ARM's business, the volume of their business is coming from the mobile space, which means a large part of that market was China, of course, from a volume perspective, right? So that could be a huge hit to ARM's business if they start getting replaced in these designs.
And it pains me to bring this part of the topic up, because it potentially affects, well, at least Nico, Nate, and my practice out here. But I think there's a concern about this. There's a spillover effect here potentially too for all U.S. technology companies, right? So right now we're talking about semiconductors and what semiconductors are used for. But who knows what's next, right? So other sectors of technology, other applications of technology. I want to open up that question in a bit, but I'll just make a quick observation that I think there's definitely some reluctance. I don't think it's wholesale at this point, but I can definitely sense that there's a little more reluctance to choose U.S. technology companies as suppliers here by Chinese buyers, and I think that's just a tension that's going to be there certainly in the short term, and I think it remains to be seen if maybe after the election or whatnot, if that tension is going to go away. I suspect that there's going to be some amount of that tension, uncertainty, and risk mitigation, you could call it, by Chinese companies. That's going to last quite a long time here. So with that, what do we see as a potential impact down the road, let's say for the entity list? Or do we see other sectors being targeted potentially? Do we see other companies being, or maybe other types of companies is a better way to talk about it, that could be affected down the road?
Well, to go back on the spill effect, on the ricochet effect, there will need to be some maybe awkward conversation between a US technology provider and its clients, not necessarily in China, but providing to China. Let's say a European company, for example, designing some tech product with Chinese tech, with Chinese software or hardware embedded in their solution that then they sell to China. So as a supplier, a US tech firm will need to actually probe the clients of its clients. You have this second degree now effect, and which is maybe a difficult conversation to have. And I'm sure that actually a lot of companies who are going to suffer are maybe not even in the US, they may be European or Indian, but suddenly they're going to need to choose between continuing to use that technology or continuing to serve Chinese clients. And this is essentially where you have companies between the hammer and the anvil. So that's the unfortunate effect. And this has been always an issue with, in general, US regulation or US ban coming in force. And I'm thinking about sanctions against countries, or anti-money laundering issues. Is essentially you have a lot of companies outside the US being affected by this. So I'm worried more about this type of middle ground clients stuck between China and the US.
Yeah, I would agree with Nico on that, especially because, for whatever people can say, the U.S. has a tremendous amount of leverage right now on especially tech and chips, like we're talking about, and they can bring that to bear on many different companies in many different countries, and there's a lot of influence to be had there. And I think now, and for the next few years, like we've been talking about, that leverage is at a peak, I think. So.
Yeah. It's interesting. Huawei itself actually brought up this this logic when the ban. I think it was the ban in May came. Of course, I'm sure that it's already something that they talked about before, but I think publicly finally made it pretty clear that this is going to do more harm. In their opinion, this is going to do more harm to U.S. technology companies than it will to Chinese technology companies in the long run, for the reasons we just kind of talked about. So it's interesting that even Huawei is making that argument, but it's a potentially effective argument, right? I mean, so it's not surprising that they are making that.
I would be curious to continue on the entity list, clients on the entity list, or this exemption. I would be very curious to see how many US tech firms are actually going to go and choose the hassle of applying and obtaining that exemption rather than just shutting down on their clients. At the end of the day, I think it will be a business decision. So I'm really looking forward to have the industry feedback essentially on how effective is the ban, and how much the company are going to choose to go the exemption route.
Yeah, I mean, I would think companies like Cadence and Synopsys would definitely be applying for a license.
Yeah.
I mean, China is probably the second biggest market after the US for them, right? So.
Yep. Yeah. It's and I'm sure that they did. So I mean, I don't know, have personal knowledge of that, but we know that 260. I think the Commerce Department said when the May rule came out that 260 companies had applied for exemptions. So that just shows you that they're not. Now I'm sure they've got not inside information, but I'm sure they had some quiet conversations over coffee or whatnot about what the internal thinking was on this. It seems to be a situation where you wouldn't kind of cherry pick which companies you give license to, right? You're either going to take an approach because as we've talked about, these companies all work together to build their solutions. So you can't give some exemptions and not others, and then it's meaningless, right? So I would think that there's some internal thought already on this within the Department of Commerce and other parts of the executive branch and so forth. So it seems like on the one hand, this as you said, Nico, taking it to the second level is pretty clearly stating the intent that, and being so directed at Huawei in the actual language that there's a pretty clear intent here. At the same time, what changed between May and now that they had to do this? I mean, that intent shouldn't have changed too much between now and then, and yet they gave those exemptions, right? They gave it. Now it was a short-term exemption. It wasn't a permanent exemption. So, but reading the tea leaves is awfully hard right now. I don't know if you guys want to cast any predictions about whether these companies will get licenses or not this time around, but it's yeah, we'll have to see.
Yeah, I guess we'll see. I also generally don't really believe in setting a ban with a built-in exemption mechanism. It's just, it doesn't make sense. Either you ban it or not. So the Chinese approach to say essentially you need to simply agree to be inspected, for example, for a certain type of product, and opening your tech will make more sense in terms of efficiency. Again, no judgment call here, but it's more efficient simply because you can always try to sell your product to China, and then you will need to essentially go through the hoops. Where if you start from a ban and then to access, you actually need to go through exemption. I think it's very counterproductive.
Yeah.
I'm willing to go out on a limb here, actually, and
All
say
right.
that I think we will see a fair number of exemptions after the election.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's my I'm going out on a limb with that one, but
Well, the timing takes us just about up to the election, right? I imagine if they're going to start to do it like last time, you still have the lame duck period. People keep forgetting about the lame duck period. So it's actually, and we're also assuming that Mr. T is on the way out. So we don't. People thought that was going to happen last time, and then the polling had some fundamental flaws in it, as we know. So so who knows what will happen between now and then? But that does seem to also be the approach that I think some Chinese companies, and I think Huawei is probably going to try and take, is to just wait and see what happens in November. But as we know, I think it was said in this group, it's these design cycles are so short, you can't just wait. Every minute counts, right? So, well, I think that's a fantastic discussion, and I love the format that we had here, guys. I think this works really well, and we'll have to come back again. And I think this topic is not going away anytime soon. So,
oh no!
Really want to thank you guys for joining.
Right, thanks
Oh,
a
thank
lot
you for having me.
Yeah,
thanks, Art.
Cool. All right, we'll sign off with that. Have a good one, and thanks to everyone for having a listen. Cheers.
Take care.
All right.
Bye.
Cheers.